Everyone on board laughed at the quiet girl, considering her a nobody. But when the plane lost control at 10,000 meters and the engines fell silent, it was she who stood up and took the controls. What happened next shocked everyone. Subscribe and write where you're watching this video from. Naomi Lewis woke before the first blue edge of dawn had cut through the gray quilt of the Chicago sky. The small apartment hummed with the soft clicks of the heating pipes, the echo of her quiet steps on the linoleum floor, the low drip of the coffee pot that sputtered, reminding her that life did not pause, not even for the weight that pressed against her chest each morning before a flight. She pressed a hand against the picture frame near the door. The photo of her daughter Asha, with her curls tied back in tiny braids, grinning with 2 missing teeth, the note and marker under the glass. "You can do anything, Mama." Naomi closed her eyes for a moment, letting herself breathe in the promise she saw in her daughter's eyes, the promise she once saw in her own reflection before the world taught her to shrink herself to fit into the narrow spaces it allowed. The morning air outside was cold, biting, the kind that made each inhale feel like a rebuke. She wrapped herself in her worn black windbreaker, zipped up to the neck, the cuffs frayed where her hands had pulled them down so many times during those endless hours of training flights and maintenance checks. She checked the straps of her simple, durable backpack twice before locking the apartment behind her, walking down the dim corridor where the lights flickered, past neighbors who did not greet her, faces hidden behind doors half closed with suspicion and weariness. The ride to the airport was quiet except for the hum of traffic and the occasional hiss of the heater in the back of the taxi. The driver, an older man with a friendly, lined face, glanced at her in the rearview mirror, making soft conversation that she answered with polite nods. When he asked, "Heading home or heading out for business?" Naomi offered a small, practiced smile, the kind that deflected further questions, the kind she had perfected to keep the world at a distance. She looked out the window, letting the rhythm of the city blur into a stream of muted lights and gray towers, letting her mind slip into that calm emptiness she used to find in the cockpit high above the clouds, when she was just a pilot, when no one saw her skin or gender, only her call sign and her flight path. At O'Hare, the crowds moved like sluggish rivers, wheeled suitcases rolling over the tiles, the scent of coffee and disinfectant and the exhaustion of business travelers who check their watches more often than their surroundings. Naomi kept her posture straight as she joined the line for security, eyes forward, breathing even, letting herself fade into the line of travelers who had the privilege of being invisible because they fit the image of who belonged. She felt the security officer's gaze on her, the subtle pause as her ID was examined longer than the man's before her, the way the woman's eyes traveled from Naomi's face to her clothes, assessing, judging, concluding. The scanner beeped, and Naomi was pulled aside for an additional pat-down, the latex gloves snapping on, the hands cold and impersonal, the muttered apology that sounded more like an accusation. She closed her eyes briefly, thinking of Asha, thinking of the promise she made to come back safe. Once through, she found her gate and sat near the window, cradling a paper cup of lukewarm coffee between her palms, watching as the sun finally crept over the skyline, its pale light cutting through the tinted glass. She pulled out her phone, scrolling past the news, past the rising noise of the world, until she found the photo of Asha again, letting her eyes soften, letting the smile return to her lips even as the tannoy crackled with boarding announcements. She could hear the laughter of 2 men a few seats away, loud, confident, the laughter of men who moved through the world without doubt. Their conversation drifted toward pilots and flights, complaints about delays, about diversity hires and how standards were dropping. Naomi sipped her coffee, letting the bitterness drown the taste of the words she didn't say. She heard one of them laugh. "As long as it's not one of those Instagram pilots up there today, we're good." And the other snorted agreement. Naomi stared out at the tarmac, the rows of planes lined up ready to lift away from the earth, their engines glinting in the light, and she let her breathing steady, let the calm settle over her like the hush before takeoff. When boarding was announced, Naomi stood, moving with quiet efficiency, ignoring the looks, ignoring the way one of the men glanced at her and then quickly away, as if the acknowledgement of her presence might demand something of him he was unwilling to give. She walked the jet bridge, the cold air leaking through the seams, the faint smell of fuel, and the distant thunder of engines somewhere farther down the line. She found her seat, 14A, a window seat, where she could let the sky be her anchor, where she could remind herself that above the clouds everything was different. Everything was clean. She placed her backpack carefully under the seat in front of her, pulling out the small pouch that held her headphones, checking them before slipping them over her ears. The seat beside her remained empty for a moment before a man in a sharp gray suit arrived, pausing to glance at her with that small, dismissive flick of the eyes, the look that said he saw her but did not consider her worthy of a greeting. He placed his briefcase in the overhead bin, sat down heavily, turning his shoulder toward her, pulling his space inward as if to shield himself from proximity. Naomi adjusted her seatbelt, checked the position of the life vest under her seat, and closed her eyes, letting the cabin noise become a dull hum, letting the vibration of the engines during taxiing sink into her bones like a familiar song. As the plane began to move, the engines roar into life, Naomi's fingers curled around the edge of her seat, not in fear, but in memory, remembering the power that came with throttle, the surge of speed that lifted thousands of pounds of steel and hope into the sky. She felt the wheels leave the ground, the tilt of the cabin as the aircraft angled upward, the way the vibrations shifted from the harsh rumble of the runway to the smooth, consistent hum of cruising climb. She opened her eyes briefly, watching the city fall away beneath them, the rivers cutting silver lines through the patchwork of streets and buildings, the clouds above calling to her, reminding her of who she had been, who she still was beneath the careful quiet she wore like armor. For a while, she allowed herself to relax into the movement of the plane, the gentle rocking as they reached cruising altitude, the seatbelt sign chiming off, the passengers around her shifting, pulling out laptops and tablets, beginning their work or their distractions. The man beside her pulled out a sleek device, tapping at emails, occasionally glancing at her, his lips twitching into a smirk when she caught his eye before he looked away, as if her presence was a curiosity to him, something beneath his concern. She turned toward the window, letting the clouds move past in slow procession, the endless sky a balm to the tightness in her chest. Time passed slowly, the sky outside shifting from the soft glow of dawn to the bright white of mid-morning. Naomi allowed her mind to drift, to let the vibrations and sounds soothe her, to let the hum of the engines remind her of long hours spent in cockpits where the world narrowed down to dials and readouts, to the feel of the controls under her hands, to the trust in her own instincts. She let herself remember those nights, the glow of the instruments lighting her face, the voice of command in her ears, the certainty of decisions made under pressure. She let herself feel the calm that came with competence, the quiet confidence that needed no applause, no recognition, because the only thing that mattered was the mission, the people, the flight itself. A flight attendant passed, offering drinks and small snacks, her eyes sliding over Naomi as if she were invisible, offering a tight, polite smile only when Naomi looked up. The man beside her asked for black coffee and a small bottle of water, ignoring Naomi completely, turning his shoulder again as if to claim the space between them as his. Naomi sipped her water slowly, letting it cool the dryness in her throat, closing her eyes again to the rhythm of the engines, the rise and fall of the cabin noises, the low conversations that ebbed and flowed like the tide. In the small moments of peace, Naomi allowed herself to think of Asha, of the small apartment they called home, of the dreams she held for her daughter. Dreams of a world where the color of her skin would not be the first thing people saw, where her worth would not need to be proven over and over again, where she would not have to carry the weight of other people's expectations on her shoulders. She allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the world would be different for Asha, that the sacrifices Naomi made, the quiet endurance, the dignity she held on to, would build a bridge for her daughter to walk across. As the plane continued its steady path toward New York, Naomi rested her head against the cool window, letting the sky be her refuge, letting the endless blue remind her that above the clouds there were no boundaries, no judgments, only the purity of the air and the promise of another day. She let herself believe for just a little while that she was just another passenger, just another mother traveling home, just another human being moving through the sky, free, if only for a moment, from the weight of the world below. The rhythm of the engines was a comfort, a low, steady hum that filled the cabin like a quiet promise of safety, a promise that Naomi let herself believe in, even as her mind remained alert beneath the calm exterior she showed the world. She kept her breathing steady, her eyes half closed behind the tinted lenses of her glasses, her hands resting lightly on the armrests as the plane sliced through the cold, high air, leaving the earth far below them. The sky outside was a hard, clear blue, the clouds beneath them drifting in endless, silent patterns that spoke to Naomi of the countless hours she had spent above them, a world where she had felt whole and powerful, where she had been nothing but a pilot, a mind and body perfectly in sync with the machine she commanded. 40 minutes had passed since the wheels had left the ground in Chicago, the city falling away like a memory, replaced by the rolling landscapes of the Midwest far below, fields and rivers twisting in silver ribbons across the brown and green. In the cabin, the passengers had settled into the quiet patterns of flight, the clatter of plastic cups and snack wrappers, the low hum of conversation, the occasional cough or laughter from the rows behind her. The man beside her had fallen into a steady rhythm of checking his emails, his fingers tapping out responses with mechanical efficiency, his phone lighting up with notifications that he checked with a frown before sighing and turning back to his screen. Naomi let herself relax into the familiarity of the flight, but her senses remained tuned to the subtle language of the aircraft, the vibrations and sounds that spoke to her of its health and mood, the slight changes in pitch and rhythm that would go unnoticed by most, but not by someone who had spent countless hours listening to engines in the darkness, where the only light came from the glow of the instruments, where the only company was the steady beat of her own heart, and the knowledge that every decision she made mattered. She let the sound of the engines become a part of her, grounding her, reminding her of who she was beneath the quiet facade, beneath the assumptions the world made about her with every glance. It started with a sound that was almost too soft to notice, a sharp, metallic pop that echoed through the bones of the plane, through the thin soles of her shoes, up into her legs, a vibration that caught her attention even as the man beside her remained oblivious, his eyes glued to his screen. Naomi's eyes snapped open, her head tilting slightly as she listened, her breath catching in her chest as she waited for the next sign, the next clue that would confirm what she already felt in the depths of her trained instincts. The sound came again, a low groan beneath the hum of the engines, a tremor that moved through the cabin floor, subtle enough that no one else seemed to notice, but to Naomi it was as loud as a siren, as clear as a warning whispered in her ear. She glanced around, her eyes sweeping over the rows of passengers, the families and business travelers, the couples sharing headphones, the children sleeping with their heads on their parents' laps, all blissfully unaware of the small, creeping wrongness that had begun to weave itself into the steady heartbeat of the flight. Naomi's hand tightened on the armrest, her breathing slow and controlled, her mind already moving through the possibilities, cataloging the sounds and vibrations, matching them to memories of past flights, of training simulations that had taught her to recognize the signs of trouble before they became emergencies. The vibrations grew stronger, a subtle shaking that began to make the plastic cups on the trays tremble, a shiver that ran through the cabin like a breath held too long, waiting to be released. Naomi's eyes narrowed as she felt the shift in the plane's movement, the way the smooth glide of their flight path began to catch, to stutter, as if the air itself had become thicker, heavier, pulling them down. She could feel the engine on the right side of the plane struggling, the vibrations becoming more pronounced, the sound of the engine changing pitch, dropping lower, rougher, a coughing growl that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. The passengers around her began to notice, their heads lifting, their conversations pausing as they glanced around, eyes questioning, uncertain, the laughter fading into a nervous silence that settled over the cabin like a heavy fog. The man beside her looked up from his phone, his brow furrowing as he glanced toward the window, then at Naomi, his eyes searching her face for reassurance he would not find. She did not look at him, her focus entirely on the sounds, the vibrations, the feel of the plane beneath her, the way it spoke to her in a language she knew better than any other. The sharp metallic pop came again, louder this time, followed by a sudden jolt that made the overhead compartments rattle, the seatbelt signs dinging on as the cabin lights flickered, a soft gasp rising from the passengers as they looked around, eyes wide with fear. Naomi's hand moved automatically to her seatbelt, tightening it across her lap as she leaned back, her mind already running through the checklist she had memorized, the steps she would take if she were in the cockpit, the procedures that would guide her through the crisis that she felt building with every moment. Then it happened. The engine on the right side of the plane gave a final, shuddering roar before falling silent, the sudden absence of its noise like a vacuum that sucked the air out of the cabin, leaving behind only the low hum of the remaining engine, struggling to keep them aloft. The plane tilted slightly, dipping to the right before the autopilot corrected, a wave of panic rolling through the cabin as passengers clutched at their armrests at each other, eyes wide and mouths open in silent screams. Naomi felt her heart pounding, but her hands remained steady, her breathing even, her mind clear as she listened to the remaining engine, the way it sputtered, the way its rhythm faltered, a stuttering beat that told her it too was failing. The lights flickered again, then came back on at half strength, the cabin dimming as the emergency power systems kicked in, the hum of the ventilation slowing as the plane began to lose altitude, the slight shift in gravity pressing them down into their seats as the plane dipped lower, the clouds outside rising up to meet them. The oxygen masks dropped from the overhead compartments, swinging on their plastic tubes like pendulums, the yellow masks bouncing off the heads of passengers who screamed, who fumbled to put them on with shaking hands, the cabin filling with the sharp scent of ozone and fear. A child began to scream, a high, piercing wail that cut through the low moans and prayers of the passengers, the sound of panic that made the air feel thick, heavy, as if it were pressing down on them, squeezing the breath from their lungs. Naomi pulled her mask down, securing it over her nose and mouth, taking slow, controlled breaths as she closed her eyes for a moment, centering herself, letting the sounds of chaos wash over her without touching the calm at her core. The intercom crackled, a voice breaking through the noise, shaking with fear, barely controlled. Ladies and gentlemen, we are currently experiencing a systems failure. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened while we assess the situation. The voice cut off abruptly, leaving behind only the sound of the cabin, the gasps and sobs of the passengers, the hiss of the oxygen flowing through the masks, the low, dying hum of the engine as it struggled to keep them in the air. Naomi opened her eyes, her gaze steady as she looked around, seeing the fear, the panic, the helplessness in the eyes of the people around her, the way they looked to each other, to the flight attendants, to anyone, for reassurance, for hope. She felt the anger rise in her, the frustration at the helplessness she saw, the knowledge that she could help, that she knew what to do, that she had the skills and the training, but that she was trapped here, in this seat, behind the thin wall of the cabin, powerless to take control. The flight attendants moved through the aisle, their faces pale, their hands shaking as they tried to calm the passengers, to help them secure their masks, to keep them seated as the plane continued to lose altitude, the ground rising to meet them, the air growing heavier with each passing moment. Naomi watched them, her eyes following their movements, calculating, assessing, waiting for the moment when she would be needed, when someone would look at her and see more than her skin, more than her gender, more than the assumptions they had made about her the moment she stepped onto the plane. She felt the plane shudder again, the left engine coughing, sputtering, the vibrations growing stronger as the lights flickered once more, the emergency lighting along the aisle casting a dim glow that turned the cabin into a tunnel of shadows and fear. She could feel the fear pressing in around her, the panic rising like a tide, but she remained still, her hands steady, her breathing even, her mind clear as she waited, knowing that the moment was coming, the moment when everything would change, when the truth of who she was would be revealed, not in words, but in action, in the quiet, steady competence that had always been her strength. And then, through the chaos, through the screams and the sobs and the prayers, she heard the footsteps, the hurried, desperate steps of the lead flight attendant, moving down the aisle, pushing past the grasping hands of the passengers, her eyes scanning the rows, looking for something, for someone. Naomi felt the shift in the air, the moment when the flight attendant's eyes met hers, the moment when the world paused, the moment of recognition, of need, of the silent request that passed between them. The flight attendant pointed, her voice shaken but loud, cutting through the noise. "You! In the window seat! We need you in the cockpit, now!" The passengers turned to look, their eyes wide, their faces pale, their fear turning to confusion, to disbelief as they saw Naomi, as they realized who the request was directed at, as they struggled to understand, to reconcile the quiet woman they had ignored with the request for help, for salvation. Naomi felt the anger rise again, the frustration, the pain of every slight, every dismissal, every time she'd been overlooked, ignored, underestimated. She felt it all, but she let it pass through her, let it go, as she reached down, unbuckling her seatbelt, standing up in the narrow aisle as the plane shuddered around her, as the eyes of the passengers followed her every move, as the whispers began, the disbelief, the skepticism, the prejudice that had always followed her. She ignored it all, her movements calm and controlled, as she handed her backpack to the flight attendant, as she nodded once firmly, as she began to walk down the aisle toward the cockpit, each step steady, deliberate, each step a reclaiming of her power, of her worth, of the truth that she had always known, but that the world had refused to see. She walked toward the chaos, toward the danger, toward the place where she belonged, where she had always belonged, where her hands on the controls could make the difference between life and death, between hope and despair. She walked toward the cockpit, and as she did, the fear around her began to change, the whispers fading, the eyes of the passengers shifting from doubt to desperate hope to belief, as they watched her move with the confidence and calm of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. And Naomi Lewis, daughter, mother, pilot, the woman who had been overlooked and underestimated for too long, stepped into the cockpit to take control, to face the storm, to save them all, because it was what she was born to do, because it was who she was. Because in the end, the sky belonged to her, and she would not let it take them down without a fight. The scent of scorched metal and burnt circuitry clung to the recycled air as Naomi stepped toward the front of the plane, her boots pressing against the trembling floor with each step, the eyes of the passengers following her like a tide of disbelief and fear. The dim emergency lights painted everything in shades of shadow and pale amber, revealing faces contorted in panic, the sheen of sweat on brows, the tight fists gripping armrests in each other's hands as prayers and curses merged into the low, terrified hum of a cabin on the edge of catastrophe. The oxygen masks swung in the air, some worn crookedly over faces stained with tears, some dangling forgotten as passengers clung to the illusion that someone else, somewhere, would fix everything before the earth rose up to meet them. As Naomi passed, she could hear the voices, the sharp whispers slicing through the low cries and gasps, voices of men who had smirked at her in the terminal, who had looked past her on the jet bridge, who now found themselves reaching for any anchor in the storm. One of them, a man in a crisp gray suit with a loosened tie and a face drained of color, spat out words with the ragged breath of someone teetering on the edge of hysteria. "You've got to be kidding me. Her? You're telling me this is who they're sending up there to save us?" His voice cracked, the disbelief in it edged with the sharp, desperate laughter of a man who realized how small he truly was when stripped of comfort and control. Another voice, younger but carrying the same bitter fear, muttered to the woman next to him, "She probably thinks this is some TikTok stunt. We're done for." His eyes were wide, darting to Naomi's face and then away, unable to hold her gaze, unable to reconcile the calm determination in her eyes with the fear twisting his own thoughts into ugly, grasping prejudice. Naomi heard it all, the words slamming against her like the countless dismissals she had endured her entire life. The subtle and overt reminders from strangers, colleagues, superiors, and even family that her place in the world was conditional, that her worth was measured not by her skill, but by the expectations and limitations others placed upon her. She felt the burn of it under her skin, the anger threatening to rise and boil over, but she pushed it down, let it settle into the deep well of resolve she had carved within herself long ago, a place where the noise of the world could not touch her, where the only voices that mattered were the ones that called her to purpose. As she reached the cockpit door, the lead flight attendant's eyes met hers, a silent plea in the trembling set of her jaw. In the tightness of her grip on the handle, she turned to open the reinforced door that separated the chaos of the cabin from the chaos waiting beyond. Naomi nodded once, a single, sharp motion that said she was ready, that she understood, that there was no hesitation left in her. She stepped through the doorway and into the cramped space of the cockpit, the smell of burnt plastic and the sharp tang of ozone even stronger here, the dim lights flickering as alarms continued to blare, the screens glitching with lines of static and error codes that pulsed in angry red. The captain was slumped against his harness, his breathing shallow and uneven, sweat pouring down his face, his eyes glassy with the fog of hypoxia and the strain of trying to control an uncontrollable descent. The co-pilot, younger and pale, struggled to stay conscious, his gloved hands twitching over the controls, trying to override the failing systems even as the plane continued to sink, the altimeter ticking down in relentless increments that meant nothing to the terrified passengers but everything to Naomi as she assessed the situation in the span of a breath. She moved without hesitation, her hands reaching for the emergency control panel, flicking switches with the muscle memory of countless hours spent in training and in the quiet hum of readiness she had kept alive even when the world had turned its back on her. She spoke in a calm, clear voice that cut through the panic like a scalpel, her words directed at the co-pilot who struggled to focus on her face. "I need you to breathe. Stay with me. I'm taking control." His eyes flickered with confusion, with fear, with the faintest glimmer of hope as he managed a nod, his hands dropping away from the yoke as Naomi settled into the seat, her fingers wrapping around the controls with a familiarity that soothed her nerves, that steadied her pulse as the alarms screamed around her. The cockpit was a mess of warning lights, the smell of overheating electronics thick in the air as she scanned the screens, piecing together the state of the systems, the options left to them, the calculations already forming in the back of her mind. She felt the plane shudder again as the remaining engine sputtered, a cough of power before it fell silent, the sudden stillness so complete that it was almost deafening. The only sounds left the rush of air past the fuselage and the desperate breathing of the men beside her. The altitude continued to drop, the ground rising to meet them, but Naomi did not allow herself to think of the ground, of the people behind her who were counting on her, of the prejudices and doubts that had followed her into this moment. She thought only of the plane, of the way it spoke to her through the tilt of its wings, the resistance in the yoke, the way it wanted to fly, even as its engines died, even as its systems failed, even as the world seemed ready to let it fall. Outside the narrow windows, the clouds were closer now, the breaks in them revealing glimpses of the land below, fields and towns, roads that twisted like veins across the earth, rivers that reflected the gray light of the day. Naomi's eyes flickered over the instruments, recalculating their glide path, adjusting for wind resistance, for the weight of the fuel still left in the tanks, for the configuration of the wings as she manually adjusted the flaps to create the best possible angle for an extended glide. She felt the resistance of the air against the surfaces, the delicate balance between too much drag and too little lift, the dance that would keep them aloft for just a little longer, long enough to find a place to land, long enough to save them all. Behind her, the murmurs of the passengers continued, low and desperate, the words blending into a fog of fear and disbelief that Naomi could feel pressing against the cockpit door like a tide. She could hear them through the thin walls, the cries, the questions, the moments when the disbelief turned to hope, to pleading, to the raw human need to believe that someone, anyone, could save them. She heard the words from the men who had doubted her, who had scoffed at her as she walked down the aisle, now whispering prayers, calling for help, their voices cracking as they realized that the woman they had dismissed was the only thing standing between them and the void. Naomi's hands moved across the controls with a steady rhythm, flipping switches, adjusting settings, manually overriding failing systems as she worked to stabilize the aircraft. She spoke into the radio, her voice calm, professional, reaching out to air traffic control, informing them of their situation, requesting vectors for an emergency landing, her words carrying the authority and clarity that came from years of training, from the deep well of competence that had always been hers, even when the world refused to see it. She felt the plane respond to her touch, the descent slowing, the glide stabilizing as she found the sweet spot between gravity and lift, coaxing the heavy aircraft into a controlled fall that was the closest thing they had to hope. The co-pilot, now breathing more evenly, watched her with wide eyes, his fear gradually giving way to something else, something like belief, as he followed her commands, flipping switches when she told him to, reading off instrument data as she recalculated their path towards the nearest possible landing site. In the cabin, the passengers sat in silence now, the panic having drained into a cold, heavy fear that left them staring at the seatbacks in front of them, clutching hands, whispering prayers, tears streaking down faces that had forgotten everything but the simple, desperate desire to survive. Naomi knew they were watching her, even if they could not see her, that they were placing their faith in her, the woman they had doubted, the woman they had dismissed, because in the face of the void, all the illusions of superiority and prejudice fell away, leaving only the stark truth that competence and calm were the only currencies that mattered. Naomi did not think of their doubts, of their prejudices, of the way they would look at her if she succeeded, of the way they might look away if she failed. She thought only of the mission, of the glide path, of the feel of the controls in her hands, of the soft, steady voice of her daughter in her memory telling her that she could do anything, that she was strong, that she was brave. She held on to that voice as she held on to the yoke, as she adjusted their path toward safety, as she became the calm in the storm, the quiet center in the chaos, the unwavering hand that would guide them through the darkness towards the fragile, precious promise of survival. And as the earth continued to rise beneath them, as the weight of every life on board pressed against her shoulders, Naomi Lewis, the woman they had underestimated, the mother, the pilot, the quiet storm, refused to let them fall. The cockpit was alive with the steady pulse of alarms, the flicker of warning lights painting Naomi's skin in red and amber as she held the yoke with a firmness that was neither desperate nor hesitant, but grounded in the calm certainty of a woman who had trained for this moment long before the world saw a need for her hands on these controls. The cabin, beyond the thin door behind her, had settled into a thick, watchful silence, each passenger waiting with breaths held too long, waiting for the unseen hands guiding them through a sky that had become unforgiving. In the narrow space, the air was heavy with the scent of burnt circuitry and the metallic tang of fear, and the low hiss of oxygen from the emergency supply whispered like a promise that there was still time, if only enough of it could be wrestled from the indifferent grip of gravity. She had taken the seat with practiced efficiency, guiding the trembling co-pilot to remain conscious, to read instruments aloud in a clear voice that shook at first but slowly steadied under her measured tone. She adjusted the rudder pedals with her feet, feeling the aircraft's subtle resistance, the way it responded like a living thing to her touch, as if it too wanted to survive, as if it too was fighting against the slow pull downward that threatened to swallow them into the hard, uncaring ground. She worked through the cascade of system failures one by one, assessing what was recoverable, what was lost, and what could be bypassed or rerouted through manual control. She did not allow herself to think of the people seated behind her as individuals, but as the weight she carried, the silent chorus that she would not allow to fall, each heartbeat behind her tied to the movements of her hands on the controls. Naomi's eyes scanned the failing displays, noting altitudes, speeds, angles, wind direction, and fuel remaining, committing them to the working calculations she assembled and adjusted with each small vibration or shift in the plane's movement. Outside the cockpit windows, the clouds were lower now, close enough that she could see the darker shapes within them, the hints of the earth beyond, glimpses of rivers and fields in broken flashes as the aircraft glided through the moist air. The descent was steady but unforgiving. Each foot of altitude lost a silent reminder of the finite distance remaining before the sky would give way entirely to the earth. She spoke into the radio with a calm that contrasted the tension hanging in the air like a weight. Her voice, low and measured, filled the headset with its quiet authority, informing air traffic control of the total engine failure, the systems lost, the systems she was managing to control, and her intention to attempt a dead-stick landing. She could hear the intake of breath on the other end of the transmission, the disbelief of the controller, quickly replaced by the clipped precision of a professional recognizing the gravity of the moment. They began to clear airspace around her, moving flights aside, prioritizing a strip of sky that Naomi claimed not with arrogance but with the solemn duty of one who had taken responsibility for lives and was prepared to bear that burden without hesitation. The co-pilot, his breathing steadier now, managed to speak, his voice small against the background of alarms and the groaning structure of the aircraft. "Ma'am, who exactly are you?" The question was not disrespectful, but filled with the fragile hope of someone seeking reassurance, and Naomi allowed herself a single breath before answering, her eyes never leaving the sky ahead. "I'm someone who's going to get us on the ground," she replied, her voice soft, unshakable, her hands tightening on the yoke as she adjusted their angle of descent to extend their glide, buying precious seconds, precious miles, precious hope. In the cabin, the passengers could feel the change even if they did not understand it. The violent, irregular drops and shudders had softened into a smoother, deliberate glide. The wild lurches replaced with a steadiness that felt like a balm against the raw edge of their fear. Some of them closed their eyes and wept silently. Some reached for hands to hold, some sat rigidly, staring ahead, afraid to believe that the worst might yet be avoided. Among them, the men who had mocked Naomi earlier found themselves quiet, their fear overpowering the entitlement that had always shielded them from recognizing their dependence on others. One of them, his face pale and wet with tears he did not bother to wipe away, whispered a prayer, the words stumbling over each other as he clutched the armrest, unaware that the strength he prayed for now came from the calm resolve of the woman in the cockpit. Naomi's mind was clear as she worked. She recalculated wind speed and direction against their glide ratio, using every scrap of altitude to find the optimal path toward a potential landing site. Her memory conjuring the maps she had studied, the landscape below becoming a mental diagram she layered with approach vectors and emergency protocols. She adjusted the trim manually, fighting the resistance of the unpowered control surfaces, her muscles straining against the physical demand of guiding a powerless aircraft, each adjustment made with the precise economy of motion that came from years of repetition, of training that had embedded itself into her reflexes like a second language. The alarms continued to flash, reminders of the systems that could not be saved, of the damage done, of the fragility of the situation. But Naomi did not falter. did not allow the noise to intrude upon her focus, treating each warning as information rather than distraction. As part of the equation, she worked constantly in her mind. She monitored the airspeed, knowing that too much would reduce their glide and bring them down too quickly. Too little would risk a stall and the catastrophic loss of control that would follow. She managed the descent like the careful pouring of water into a narrow funnel, controlling the flow with each slight adjustment, each moment a decision, each second an opportunity to keep them in the air, to keep them alive. She spoke to the co-pilot in a steady, quiet tone, guiding him to assist her in managing the few systems they still controlled, to read off data she requested, to flip switches at her command, each action a reinforcement of the control she was establishing over the situation. In those moments, she could feel the shift within him, the transformation from fear to trust, the way his eyes began to mirror the determination in hers, the way his voice steadied as he became part of the fight to save the aircraft. It was not the loud heroism of movies, but the quiet, relentless competence that held power, that inspired confidence even in the darkest moments. Outside, the clouds broke to reveal the patchwork of land below, roads and rivers, the occasional glint of sunlight on water, the distant shimmer of the city on the horizon. Naomi adjusted their heading, guiding the aircraft toward a stretch of open land she recognized as a potential emergency landing site, calculating the distance against their rate of descent, adjusting for the crosswinds she could feel tugging against the aircraft, the subtle push and pull of the air that spoke to her like an old friend she had not seen in too long. She felt the moment the plane responded to her, the shift from the ragged fall of a dying machine to the gliding descent of a craft under the guidance of a steady hand, the alignment of movement and will that transformed fear into fragile hope. It was not victory, not yet, but it was the first step, the reclaiming of agency from the chaos, the proof that as long as she held the yoke, as long as she continued to fight, there was a chance. In the cabin, the passengers felt it too. The tension that had bound them so tightly began to loosen, the silence giving way to the sound of breathing, of quiet sobs, of whispered words of hope. They did not know Naomi, did not know her name or her story, did not know the countless times she had been told she did not belong, the countless times she had been overlooked, underestimated, dismissed. They did not know the strength it had taken to step forward, to take control, to become the steady hands guiding them through the storm. But they felt her presence in the way the plane moved, in the steadiness of its glide, in the fragile, precious promise of survival she held for them in her hands. Naomi did not allow herself to think of what came next, of what would happen if she succeeded, if she brought them down safely, if the world would see her as she was, or if they would return to their comfortable illusions once their feet were back on solid ground. She focused only on the task, on the sky, on the plane, on the lives she carried with her, each adjustment of the yoke a vow she made to herself, to her daughter, to every person who had ever told her she could not, that she would. The sky ahead was clear, the land rising to meet them, the moment of reckoning approaching with each passing second. Naomi Lewis, her hands steady on the yoke, her mind clear, her spirit unyielding, guided the plane through the air with the quiet, relentless strength of a woman who knew that competence was not given but proven, that respect was not granted but earned, and that sometimes the most powerful voice in the storm was the one that spoke calmly, steadily, with the hands that refused to let go. She would not let go. The hush inside the cockpit settled like a protective layer over the screaming alarms and muted the crackle of the comms, wrapping Naomi in the singular focus of the final moments before the ground would rise to meet them. The transition from sky to earth was a ritual she had learned to respect, not simply as the inevitable ending of a flight, but as the test that measured the worth of all the hours in the air, all the hours in the simulators, all the hours of doubt she had endured and swallowed so that she could stand, as she stood now, between life and death for those behind her. The co-pilot beside her had gone quiet, his eyes darting over the instruments with a rigid tension, his hands hovering above the panel as if he was afraid that even a breath might disturb the fragile hold Naomi had established over the dying plane's descent. She did not need him to speak. She needed him to remain present, to remain conscious, to be ready to respond with the checklist she had committed to memory when she had first learned how to command the sky with engines roaring at her back, and when she had learned how to glide in silence, preserving altitude with the kind of reverence that comes only when you understand that altitude is life, that feet and seconds are interchangeable when gravity is your constant, unrelenting adversary. They were descending over a patchwork of rural roads and open fields, the occasional glint of a roof or a parked car catching the light of a gray, uncertain afternoon sun. Naomi studied the terrain, checking the wind direction by the drift in the trees, the wavering dance of the grass bending in the open spaces, and the shadow of the aircraft that moved beneath them with a faithful, inevitable companionship. The shadow was growing larger, clearer, a reminder of how little space remained between them and the world below. Her voice, when she spoke into the radio, was steady, the same low, calm cadence she had used in every emergency drill that had never quite captured the stakes of this moment, but had prepared her body and mind to perform nonetheless. She informed the tower of their position, their altitude, their airspeed, and the intention to proceed with a dead-stick landing, using a field she had identified west of the nearest town as the most viable landing strip given the gliding trajectory and the distance she could still squeeze from the airspeed available. There was silence on the other end of the transmission, the kind of silence that spoke of a room full of controllers holding their breath, heads turning toward supervisors, eyes widening as they understood the gravity of the report Naomi had just delivered. The silence lasted only a moment before the voice came back, calm, professional, but softer now, the way people speak when they realize they are witnessing something that matters, something they will remember for the rest of their lives. Copy, United Flight 847. You are clear for priority landing on all available frequencies. Emergency crews are in position. You have our full attention. Naomi acknowledged the transmission, the words spoken with the same precision and absence of flourish that had marked every decision she made since the engines died. She allowed herself a single breath, a moment in which the image of her daughter, Asha, rose in her mind, the bright, fearless eyes of a child who still believed her mother could do anything. Naomi carried that belief into the final adjustments, into the last calculations that would transform a powerless descent into a landing, into the promise she had made in the silence of her own heart that she would return, that she would not fail. In the cabin, the silence that had settled was not peaceful, but dense with fear and the fragile threads of hope that had begun to form as the passengers felt the aircraft's glide stabilizing, felt the absence of the terrifying lurches and sudden drops that had characterized the first moments of the crisis. Children clung to parents, the elderly held hands, strangers leaned into one another, seeking human contact as the minutes stretched long and uncertain. The men who had once scoffed, who had rolled their eyes when Naomi walked past them, now sat with heads bowed, lips moving in silent prayers, glancing toward the front of the plane where they could see only the closed cockpit door, but could feel, through the steadiness of the glide, the presence of the woman who was fighting for every second of their lives. Naomi felt the plane respond to her touch, each adjustment of the yoke a conversation with the air, with the machine, with the laws of physics that she had learned to respect and bend as far as they would allow without breaking. She kept the nose level, adjusted the trim to reduce the sink rate, used the remaining altitude to extend their glide toward the field that had become her focus, the place where sky and earth would meet on her terms, not on the terms of the failure that had threatened to end them all. The last few hundred feet were the hardest. The world outside became sharper, the details of the field, the uneven ground, the small obstacles she would need to avoid in the final seconds before touchdown. She could see a fence line, a ditch, the rise and fall of the earth that would complicate the landing, but there was no time for hesitation, no room for doubt. Naomi adjusted the flaps manually, compensating for the lack of hydraulic assistance with the strength in her arms, feeling the resistance as the control surfaces shifted, the plane's nose lifting slightly, bleeding off the last of the airspeed in exchange for distance. Inside the cabin, the tension was palpable. The oxygen masks hung limp now, the emergency lights casting their pale glow on faces that had become pale mirrors of hope and fear, of prayers whispered with lips that trembled. Some passengers clutched at each other, some wept quietly, some simply closed their eyes and waited for the ground, for the final jolt that would tell them whether they would walk away or whether their journey would end in the mud and grass of an unplanned landing strip. Naomi's focus narrowed to the seconds that remained, to the alignment of the aircraft with the chosen landing path, to the angle of descent, to the precise moment when she would need to flare, to raise the nose and allow the main gear to touch first, to absorb the shock, to protect the fuselage and the precious lives it carried. The wind shifted, a subtle change she felt in the resistance against the control surfaces, and she adjusted, compensating, aligning, breathing in the silence before the storm of touchdown. The ground rushed upward, the last feet disappearing in a blur of motion as she pulled back gently, feeling the lift drain away as the airspeed bled off, the main gear striking the earth with a jolt that rattled through the frame of the aircraft, through the bones of every passenger, through Naomi's hands as she fought to keep the nose up, to prevent the plane from burying itself into the uneven field. The second jolt came as the nose gear touched, the world shaking, grass and mud flying in the wake of the skidding tires, the plane's momentum fighting against the friction of the earth, against the pull of gravity that wanted to drag them into a violent stop. Naomi deployed the emergency braking systems, using aerodynamic drag as much as the failing mechanical systems, steering with careful, deliberate movements to avoid the worst of the ruts and rises in the field, guiding the aircraft with a precision born of thousands of hours of training, of the unshakable calm she had built from years of being told she was not enough and proving time and time again that she was. The plane slowed, the vibrations decreasing as the momentum bled away, the field tearing itself into muddy tracks beneath them as the aircraft rolled to a stop, the final shuddering halt echoing through the silence that followed, a silence so deep it seemed to swallow the world, broken only by the soft, incredulous sobs of the passengers, by the quiet prayers of thanks whispered with voices raw from screaming. Naomi sat for a moment, her hands still on the yoke, her breathing slow, measured, the adrenaline fading into the exhaustion that followed, the weight of what had just been done settling into her bones. She closed her eyes briefly, seeing Asha's face, the bright eyes, the fearless smile, and she allowed herself a small, tired smile in return. The co-pilot turned to her, his face pale, streaked with sweat, eyes wide with the raw, unfiltered respect of a man who had seen competence where he least expected it and would never forget it. He opened his mouth to speak, but found no words, and Naomi simply nodded, the gesture saying everything that needed to be said. Outside, emergency vehicles were already approaching, the flashing lights reflecting off the fuselage, the shouting of rescue crews cutting through the air as they prepared to open the doors to evacuate the passengers to bring them back to the earth they had almost lost. Inside the cabin, the passengers began to move, slowly, as if waking from a shared nightmare, the realization dawning that they were alive, that the world outside was still there, that they would step onto the ground and breathe the air and see the sky again. Naomi released the yoke, her hands trembling now that the work was done. The silence before the touchdown transformed into the quiet after survival, the hush of people realizing that the impossible had been made possible, not by luck, not by hope alone, but by the steady, unshakable hands of the woman they had overlooked, the woman they had doubted, the woman who had saved them all. And as the doors opened and the fresh air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of grass and mud and life, Naomi Lewis, pilot, mother, survivor, rose from her seat, ready to return to a world that might still not see her as she was, but which would, for this moment, owe her everything. The engines were silent, the only sound the tick of metal cooling beneath the overcast sky, and the muffled shuffle of feet as rescue teams moved across the muddy field toward the aircraft that lay heavy and still upon the grass. The wind rippled through the open hatch as the doors were pulled aside, carrying with it the scent of wet earth, diesel, and the sharp tang of rain that threatened to fall. For a moment, the world was suspended in the echo of survival, in the fragile hush that followed the breathless seconds when the impossible had been made real, not by miracles, but by the relentless focus of steady hands on a failing yoke. Inside the cabin, people were rising from their seats as if waking from a long, terrifying sleep, hands gripping armrests, eyes blinking in disbelief as the realization of their survival settled over them. Some sobbed openly, clutching at each other, while others moved quietly, their faces pale and streaked with tears, eyes downcast as if ashamed to look at the others, as if the rawness of the fear they had shared was too much to witness in the light of survival. The oxygen mask swung gently on their cords, the smell of the emergency systems lingering in the air, a reminder of how close the end had come and how thin the line between life and death had been. Naomi stood in the cockpit for a moment longer, her hands still resting on the yoke, the echo of the vibrations still present in her arms, a ghost of the resistance she had fought against, the trembling of metal and air that had tested her strength and her will. She let the breath she had been holding slip out slowly, quietly, the silence around her pressing close as she allowed herself to acknowledge, for the first time, the magnitude of what she had done. The co-pilot turned to her, his face pale and open, eyes wide with the rawness of gratitude and disbelief, his mouth opening to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Naomi met his gaze and nodded once, a quiet acknowledgement that words were not necessary, that there would be time, perhaps, for them later, but that this moment was not for them. She stepped out of the cockpit and into the cabin, her boots touching the thin carpet as if it were the ground itself, the path before her opening as passengers turned, eyes widening as they recognized her, as they saw the calm, steady woman who had taken control when everything else had failed. Some looked away, shame rising like heat on their skin as they remembered their words, their doubt, the dismissive glances they had thrown in her direction when she had been just another passenger, just another quiet woman in a seat by the window, someone who did not belong in the world of their assumptions and their certainty. Others reached for her as she passed, their hands brushing against her sleeve, their lips moving in whispers of gratitude, of blessings, of thanks that fell away as they met her calm gaze. Naomi accepted each look, each whisper, not with pride, but with the quiet dignity of someone who had done what needed to be done, who had stepped forward not for praise, but because there was no one else, because she had the skill, the knowledge, the unyielding will to see it through. She met each gaze without hesitation, her eyes steady, her expression soft but resolute, a silent reminder that they were alive because she had refused to let them fall. The first passengers stepped down from the aircraft, touching the ground with trembling hands as if to confirm it was real, some dropping to their knees in the mud, weeping, kissing the earth, clutching at their children with the desperate relief that came from the promise of another day. The rain began to fall in light, cold drops pattering against the fuselage, running in thin lines across the windows as the sky wept softly for the fear that had passed, for the lives that had been spared. Emergency crews moved among the passengers, offering blankets, checking for injuries, their voices low and calm as they guided people away from the aircraft, away from the broken shadow of what could have been. Naomi stood at the door, watching them go, her hands folded in front of her, her breathing steady as she scanned the faces, noting each one, the lines of fear easing into lines of relief, the disbelief softening into gratitude. She felt the weight of each life, the collective breath of the people she had carried through the sky, pressing against her like a silent chorus, reminding her of the promise she had made to herself, to her daughter, to the memory of every moment when she had been told she was not enough. She had proven, not to them, but to herself, that she was more than enough, that she was the calm in the storm, the steady hand in the chaos, the quiet strength that refused to falter when the world demanded it most. One of the businessmen who had mocked her, who had rolled his eyes and whispered to his colleague as she walked past him to the cockpit, approached her now, his expensive shoes sinking into the mud, his suit stained with rain and grass, his face pale and streaked with tears he no longer tried to hide. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes dropping to the ground, his hands shaking as he tried to speak, the words breaking apart before they could leave his lips. Naomi watched him, her expression calm, waiting, allowing him the space to find the words he needed to say. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet, his face lined with the rawness of humility, of the understanding that comes when the illusion of superiority has been stripped away by the undeniable truth of survival. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice cracking, the words small but heavy, carrying the weight of his shame, his regret, his recognition of the woman he had overlooked, the woman who had saved him despite it all. Naomi nodded once, the movement small but clear, her eyes meeting his without judgment, accepting his words not as absolution, but as acknowledgement, as the first step toward something that might, one day, be understanding. She moved past him, stepping down onto the wet grass, the cold mud seeping into the fabric of her boots, the rain falling on her face as she tilted her head back, letting the drops wash away the sweat, the fear, the remnants of the battle she had fought in the silent sky. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the scent of rain and earth, the freshness of life renewed, the promise of another day. Around her, passengers were gathering in small groups, some embracing, some sitting quietly, staring at the aircraft that had brought them back to the ground, the aircraft that had become their lifeboat in the sky. The rescue crews moved among them, guiding them toward the buses that would take them away from the field, away from the memory of the fear they had carried, toward the safety of warm blankets and waiting families. Naomi stood apart for a moment, watching, her mind quiet, her heart steady as she allowed herself to feel the enormity of what had passed, the weight of the lives she had carried, and the knowledge that they would continue, that their stories would go on, that the children would grow, the parents would return home, the elders would see another dawn, because she had been there, because she had refused to let them fall. The rain fell harder now, drumming on the metal of the aircraft, washing away the last traces of smoke and fear, leaving behind only the quiet, persistent sound of life continuing, of the earth reclaiming the space that had been so close to becoming a grave. Naomi turned away from the aircraft, her steps steady as she walked toward the buses, the mud sucking at her boots, the rain plastering her hair to her face, the cold air biting at her skin. She did not rush, did not hide from the rain, letting it soak into her, letting it cleanse the weight of the moments that had passed, the fear, the doubt, the noise of the world that had told her she could not. As she approached the bus, she paused, turning to look back at the aircraft, the silent, still machine that had carried them through the storm, that had trusted her hands, her judgment, her strength. She felt a quiet connection to it, a recognition of the fight they had shared, the unspoken agreement between machine and pilot that they would not give in, that they would find a way, that they would survive. She raised a hand in a small, private gesture of thanks, of farewell, before turning away once more, stepping onto the bus, into the warmth, into the eyes of the passengers who now saw her, truly saw her, with the respect that could only be earned in the crucible of survival. As the bus pulled away, Naomi sat by the window, the rain blurring the world outside into streaks of gray and green, the field receding behind them as the aircraft grew smaller, a silent sentinel in the grass. She let her head rest against the glass, her eyes closing as the exhaustion settled into her bones, the adrenaline fading, leaving behind the quiet, steady heartbeat of a woman who had done what needed to be done, who had fought for every breath, who had brought them home. She did not think of what the world would say, of the headlines that might come, of the stories that would be told. She thought only of Asha, of the promise she had made, of the quiet truth that in the moment when it mattered most, she had been enough. She had been more than enough. And for now that was all that mattered. The days that followed settled upon Naomi with a stillness that felt heavier than the roar of the engines or the silence of the powerless glide. In the quiet of her small apartment, she found herself moving from room to room with the deliberate calm of someone whose body was still unwinding the memory of tension, whose mind replayed the descent with a clarity that came unbidden in the hush before dawn. The apartment smelled faintly of rain from the open window she left cracked at night, the cool air pressing against her skin as she stood in the dark, looking at the faint glow of the city lights on the horizon, the same city that had felt impossibly far away when the earth had been rising to meet her. She would sometimes find herself standing at the kitchen counter, her hand resting on the chipped surface, the kettle hissing in the background, as she remembered the feel of the yoke in her hands, the steady pressure, the resistance, the subtle shifts of the air that had spoken to her through the machine. She remembered the faces of the passengers as they passed her, the murmurs of thanks, the averted eyes, the tears, the gratitude they could not put into words. She remembered the businessman who had stopped, his voice trembling as he had thanked her, the way his eyes had dropped, unable to hold her gaze, the quiet shame in the curve of his shoulders as he turned away. She remembered the feel of the mud under her boots as she stepped onto the ground, the rain soaking her hair, the cold that sank into her bones and reminded her that she was alive, that they were all alive. The news had come quickly, the headlines circling the event with the same shallow curiosity that accompanied every story that was consumed before being discarded for the next. Unidentified woman lands passenger plane after complete engine failure. Heroic passenger saves dozens. Miracle landing in a field. The reports were vague, the details blurred, the focus always on the spectacle of the failure, the images of the aircraft resting in the field, the mud-streaked fuselage, the passengers wrapped in blankets, stepping away with dazed expressions. Naomi's name was not in the headlines, and she felt no need to correct them, no desire to step into the glare of a world that had never truly seen her until it needed her to exist beyond its assumptions. There were calls from reporters, messages left with the apartment building manager, emails that found their way into the inbox she barely checked, each one requesting a comment, an interview, her story. Naomi read them with a quiet detachment before closing the laptop, letting the requests pile up unanswered, letting the world move on as it always did, its appetite for stories endless, its memory short. She did not need to speak, did not need to explain, did not need to justify the calm that had guided her through the fear, the competence that had saved them all. She had nothing to prove, not anymore. Asha returned home from school with wide eyes, clutching the hand of her neighbor who looked at Naomi with a quiet reverence, the kind that said she had seen the news, that she knew, that she would not ask questions she did not need answered. Asha's backpack was heavy with books, and she dropped it by the door before running into Naomi's arms, the small, fierce hug grounding Naomi more than the feel of earth under her boots ever could. "Mama, they said on the news that a lady saved all those people. Was that you?" Her voice was soft, uncertain, her eyes wide with the innocence of someone who still believed the world was simple. Naomi knelt down, brushing the hair back from her daughter's face, looking into the eyes that mirrored her own. "It was me, baby," she said, her voice low, steady, the truth simple and clear in the space between them. Asha's eyes widened further, a smile breaking across her face, the kind of smile that lit up the small apartment, that made the chipped paint and the worn furniture disappear, replaced by the warmth of that moment. "I knew you could do it," Asha whispered, her arms wrapping around Naomi's neck, holding her tightly, as if she could keep her there, safe, forever. In the weeks that followed, Naomi returned to her routines, walking Asha to school, grocery shopping, running in the early mornings when the city was still quiet, the streets empty, the air cool against her skin. She found herself looking at the sky more often, watching the planes that crossed above, small silver shapes against the endless blue, the contrails they left behind like faint signatures of lives moving from one place to another, unaware of the silence that could come, of the thin line that held them in the air. She felt no bitterness, only a quiet understanding, a connection to the sky that remained, a reminder of who she was, of what she had done, of what she would always be. She received a letter one morning, slipped under her door in an envelope marked with no return address, the handwriting on the front careful, deliberate. She opened it slowly, unfolding the single sheet of paper to read the words written in neat, precise script. "Some people fly with the weight of the world on their shoulders. Some fly because they have no choice. You fly with purpose, with skill, with the quiet strength that holds others aloft when they cannot hold themselves. Thank you for reminding us all what it means to be truly present when it matters. Respectfully, Commander Michael Blaine, 139th Airlift Wing." Naomi read the letter twice before folding it carefully, placing it in the drawer beside her bed, the words settling into the quiet spaces of her heart, a reminder that there were those who had seen, who had known, who understood. When Naomi flew again, weeks later, on a quiet morning flight to visit her mother, she noticed the 14th row remained empty as she checked in, her name appearing on the screen with a quiet prompt from the agent, who looked up with a flicker of recognition before nodding once, saying nothing, allowing her to pass without the usual checks, without the weight of suspicion that often followed her through the gates. She sat by the window, Asha's small hand clutching hers as they watched the tarmac roll by, the engines humming, the vibration underfoot reminding Naomi of the living presence of the machine, of the trust that existed between pilot and aircraft, between sky and earth. As the plane lifted into the air, Naomi felt the gentle rise of the ground falling away, the lightness that came with ascent, the quiet promise of the sky stretching out before them. She looked at Asha, who was pressing her face against the window, her breath fogging the glass as she watched the clouds pass, the excitement of flight clear in the way her small fingers drummed against the armrest. Naomi squeezed her hand gently, letting her eyes close for a moment, feeling the hum of the engines, the smoothness of the climb, the promise of another safe landing waiting at the end of the journey. When the plane touched down, the wheels kissing the runway with the practiced ease of a pilot who knew the weight of the lives she carried, Naomi opened her eyes, looking out at the world that continued, the world that moved forward, the world that would never truly know the depth of what had passed, but that would continue because it had to. She unbuckled her seatbelt, standing slowly, feeling the stretch of her muscles, the quiet strength that remained in her, the unshakable calm that had become her anchor. As they stepped off the plane, Asha skipping ahead, Naomi felt the eyes of the flight crew on her, small nods of respect passing between them, unspoken but understood, a recognition that did not need words. She returned their nods with a quiet smile, her steps steady as she moved through the gate, the airport alive with the noise of travelers, with the hum of engines, with the promise of journeys beginning and ending. Naomi Lewis, who had once been overlooked, who had once been dismissed, walked forward into the light of another day, carrying with her the knowledge of what she had done, of who she was, of the promise she had made to herself and to her daughter, a promise kept not for the world to see, but for the quiet truth that lived within her. She moved through the crowd, her presence unremarkable to those who passed. That was how she wanted it. The quiet competence, the steady strength, the unyielding calm that needed no recognition to exist. And somewhere, above the clouds, the sky remained vast and endless, waiting for the next moment when quiet hands and a calm voice would rise to meet the storm, when the strength of one would carry the lives of many, when the world would be reminded, once again, that sometimes the quietest among us are the ones who hold us all aloft when everything else falls away. If you found this story powerful, don't forget to subscribe for more. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and check out our other stories to keep inspired.